This is not about you. The premise of the show is simple. I wanted to ask marginalized folks to tell a white guy, that's me, what question or questions they wish they never had to hear again. They did just that, and then we talked about those questions. Hopefully they provided some answers they don't have to give anymore. I'm Levi. I'm the host and producer of Not About You. In addition to being a podcast maker and a perpetual question asker, I'm a comedy writer and performer. I have been my whole adult life, so this show is sincere and heartfelt, but it also is full of humor. I've set up a voicemail line, 612-361-9261, where you can share comments, suggestions, or your own personal stories that connect to these conversations. And I will use them in future episodes of the show. You tell me which episode you're responding to, and I'll try to collect them together, or I may just share some responses as they come in. Again, that voicemail, 612-361-9261. You can also connect with us on social media. The hashtag is NAPOD, N-A-Y-P-O-D. It's Not About You Pod on Twitter or Not About You on Facebook. This is episode 6, my conversation with Heid Erdrich. I really appreciate you listening. This is Not About You.
My name is Heid Erdrich. I'm a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe. I'm enrolled in my tribe in North Dakota where I grew up, and I'm an artist and writer, poet. I work with visual artists, especially Native visual artists in the Twin Cities. I collaborate on short films with animator Jonathan Thunder and filmmaker Elizabeth Day. I've published 7 books. And I work with themes of women's bodies. I think of myself as a feminist and as a person interested in critical, creative views of how systems work.
Well, thanks for talking to me, Heid. I'm really happy that you are taking the time to share a little with me. I think you already hit on the fact that you're deeply embedded in work around culture and identity. Like seems like a big part of your work.
Yeah, I would say that's a big part of my work, although I never think of it that way. I think about who I work with, but sometimes when I'm asked questions about culture or identity, I get stopped. I sort of get stopped. I'm like, oh, wait, what does that mean to other people now? Because I'm, living my daily life. I'm not stepping back and looking at what my identity is. And I think it's really hard sometimes for people to identify, because what you have to assume is an outside audience. What would they recognize if you said you were those things? Or, maybe it's like circles, micro. Somebody will know who I am. If I'm in a group of assorted relatives and I say I'm Rita's girl, they know who that is, right?
Yeah.
And then it just goes on and on from there. There's like concentric rings, and to the larger culture, you identify in certain ways. I've got 7 books. That identifies me to the larger culture, right?
And it legitimizes you in a certain context, while the other, like Rita's girl, legitimizes you in a totally different context.
Yeah. So I would identify a lot of different ways, and I've been thinking about that a lot lately because, like I told you, I've been going around asking people how do they identify.
Yeah.
And they don't always answer the question the way I think they would. And I realize now that you answer that question differently regularly. The one constant, of course, would be that I'm a writer and an artist, and I'm a member of my tribe, and I'm a woman.
You're those things regardless of context, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think those things are really regardless of context. And then there's other intrinsic things I think that would be in my identification. Yeah.
Well, so I think there's a lot of different aspects to unpack there, but I think maybe my question is, you're a member of a tribe, mm-hmm. and you're a woman. Mm-hmm. Those are separately categories that are, I don't want to say under attack, but like...
they make it harder in the world.
Yeah.
In some ways they have...
There's a lot of power there, too.
Yeah, they have lovely grace and privileges in some ways, too, that I recognize.
But are there I mean, maybe that's the thing. Like, do you have to do work to stay in the place of thinking about what you get, how you're aided by having those perspectives rather than the barriers they create?
Do I have to do work to think about it? I don't know that I do have to do work to think about how I'm aided by them. I think because I'm also white, although I don't really think about myself that way. I'm white appearing, I'm white privileged, I'm white passing, whether I want to or not. I think I have always had to be aware of how I am those things, but I'm perceived differently. It's not the same thing to be a woman of color or a recognizably indigenous woman. It's a different thing, and I think I've always known that. Maybe I didn't use those terms for it, but it's something I've always known. So I've always had this sort of marginal within my own identities. I'm also a woman who doesn't conform to a lot of female, I don't even know what to call them, female, not stereotypes, but necessities. You know, I'm a large woman. I did not conform to keeping myself to a small size. You know, there's a lot of things that I do differently as a woman. I don't wear makeup very often, or almost never. Don't wear real feminine clothes, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm aware of those things always, but I don't feel like I have to work around them. They're just part of the whole donut. So
in the area of other people will identify you as white, or you can pass, is that sort of term that's used all the time.
Mm-hmm. It's so old-fashioned, but it's back. It's back.
It is back.
Passing is back.
Right, and it's differently loaded than it used to be.
Right, yeah.
It seems like it was used as a bludgeon for quite a while. I don't know how it is used as much now.
Well, I think it's different for different communities. It wasn't something, the first time I encountered it was when I became friendly or part of a group that was largely African American, and then the idea of passing was, it was something that people recognized as historically, like maybe for the 1950s, something that just happened, or people sneakily did it to survive or to get, to better themselves, whatever reason. It was a secret. But then I think now it's more like recognizing that you're always passing that's a very different thing. To know that you're walking around in the supermarket and somebody probably doesn't have you pegged as not white. It's a different thing to talk about it. It's not something I haven't always known, because I often am not in the company of other white people or white appearing people. So it's definitely something I've always been aware of.
What does it do knowing that, like, that you can be in like a majority white space and be viewed as a peer and not othered, but also you've, I'm sure, had lots of experiences being in a majority indigenous space and be viewed as a peer and maybe not othered there. Mm-hmm. Does that impact the way you react to mistreatment of indigenous peoples? Like,
oh, sure.
Taking, something's upsetting or something's impacting you.
Yeah.
I wonder if there are times where you have to explain, or like you're not sure if people will get why it's hitting you so hard if they're not thinking of you that way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is like the essential, it's the seed of my identity. It's the formation of it as a child living in a community that had a large Native population, but we all lived sort of in the same part of town. We all our parents all worked the same place. Some of us were related. When I realized at probably school age that there would be some people who didn't even know I was Native, or some people who would, and that I was going to have to switch and swap between things. It was literally that I had to choose sides because there was racial tension. I guess we wouldn't have called it that. It was just how things were. And there were literally fights between the Indian kids, as we called ourselves then, and white kids, and you had to pick a side. There was a line, and you picked it, and there was no question which side I was going to be on. I picked the Indian side when I was a kid, and so I definitely knew that there was going to be a lifetime of switching this way, moving that way, and it's all I could have, and I feel lucky for it in a lot of ways. But yeah, I've been in the room like as an adult and as a art maker and as a community member where the assumption is that there's no other person of color. There's nobody in the room who has the other that they're talking about, and it's a weird situation. And I may have to like make myself known and in subtle or obvious ways. I mean, that it helps having a name and a reputation where people kind of know that about me in the Twin Cities and in other contexts that I put myself into. But I've definitely been there. I've been there my whole life.
For each of these 10 episodes of Not About You, I put out requests for folks to call in with responses to questions that come up in each episode. So a few people left voicemails, and I'll be sharing some of those in the middle of some of these conversations. You have reached the Not About You voicemail line. Leave a message after the tone.
Hey, Levi, it's Taj. All right, I'm going to answer another one of these questions. Why is cultural appropriation of Native American images and ideas not just not okay, but actually destructive? Well, I believe it perpetuates a stereotype. Seeing things like the Cleveland team that lost the World Series, and other baseball teams and sports teams that use images that just enforce a stereotype is pretty terrible. So,
Now let's get back to the conversation. I think this can even help somebody who is not Indigenous or not Native, is when you decide to call out like appropriation. I think that's one of the things I mean, there are plenty of things that I feel like Native peoples have suffered from, but one of the weird ongoing things is the still totally accepted appropriation of symbols and
and there's so many levels and layers of that appropriation too, that they are. I started recently posting on my Facebook the days when I don't deal with some level of appropriation. And like, I rarely get past a week when one of many things that feel appropriate to me doesn't happen. And, I'm always happy when it happens. And some days it's so bad I have to post day 0 again because, but there's so many layers and levels. There's things that the first thing that I think I got involved in as a teenager was the mascot issue of Native mascots and Indian mascots and Indian head teams and so forth. And that was very obvious to me wrong because it embarrassed me crucially and vitally as a child to see people playing Indian and pretending. And I felt that way from really young, and I think that kind of came from my family upbringing. My mom didn't like it. She didn't even like Indian dolls. She thought they were ugly and, incorrect. And so there was a lot of that was probably something I got from my family. Going to a college where there had been an Indian symbol and constantly fighting that fight. I learned a lot fighting that fight. But then, as I worked as an artist and I encountered other artists appropriating, it was obvious to me that there's more to it than what people think is just entertainment or it's just a story, it's just a book, it's all made up, it's just art, it's no big deal. If it were no big deal, people would let it go. It wouldn't keep going and keep going and keep going. People want to control the image. They want to consume an image. They want you to recapitulate that image if you're an Indigenous artist or writer or activist or whoever you are. They really want to see the thing that they're comfortable with because they know how to act toward that. And the sad part is they know how to act toward that because they have disposed of it for so long. So they know how to get rid of that because that's something they've gotten rid of before.
It feels like there's a piece there that's also, if I change, that's an acknowledgement that I was wrong. Like if I change my thinking or if I stop using this image that I'm not supposed to use, it's a way of saying that means that I made a lot of mistakes for a lot of years.
I didn't know that. You're just telling me. I never knew why people, I don't know why they don't let go. I've started to think, I try to be a humanist, I try to think, and I try to be a compassionate, empathetic person, and I try to understand why people would fiercely cling to their fake Indian identity, their Indian head logo, their use of Native imagery in their visual art, their need to put Native characters or Indian characters into their fiction, their need to, use imagery associated with Native people on their poetry books or in their poetry. Why are they clinging to these things? Why do they let themselves be cast as Native characters in plays. Why are they clinging to this so fiercely? And my empathetic feeling, my compassion tells me that they're lacking culture. This people must want another culture. They want to be connected to something. They need it, and they can't do without it. And they don't have clans, so they have sports teams. They don't feel confident in something about their art, so they go to an art that they know is appealing. Those are the things that I see. That's what I think's going on. I didn't know it was because they have to say they're wrong.
I have no. I mean, that's
well, it could be. No, I believe it is true. It just never occurred to me that that's what it is, because I was trying to think about what humanly would compel them to connect so deeply with something that is clearly not part of their life or existence.
Well, what do you think about that idea? I think there is this perceived idea that a person who is a member of a tribe, of a Native community, feels deeply connected to their culture. They are in touch with their ancestors. They have rituals. They have traditions. And I feel like some of that is really hyper-romanticized.
Oh, sure. That's all romanticized. Not everybody has that. All you have when you're enrolled in a tribe is a legal connection to a people with a land base. Anything else you get from your family, friends, the larger group, whatever they can give you. Not everybody can get that. People have issues of where they live. Not everybody lives on their land base. Whether their family was functional or dysfunctional, whether they are poverty-stricken and can access ceremonies. The ceremonies are a privilege for so many people. You got to have gas money. You got to have the gear. There's so many things that are part of that. Whether your family had been shamed into not participating, those things are all. Which makes it even harder when people appropriate those things because they don't know how hard won they were. They were illegal when I was a kid. I was 1978. I was a teenager. I was, a grown woman in many ways, and I didn't even know that the ceremonies that my grandfather was performing had just become legal. I didn't know that he could have been persecuted for them. I had no idea. So and then to think that other people, come along and take that stuff is just bizarre and it feels unfair. I think I got off the topic there.
No, I think that's totally on topic. That there's what you hit on, that a sports symbol matters to someone because it's a way of them having some culture, of them having some connection, some tradition. Yeah. Seems deeply true. Mm-hmm. And it also seems kind of I don't know if it's an easy way, but it's a simple way. Like that's handed down often from generation to generation.
Yeah, it's something, it feels like a tradition to them, and I guess it is. It's a tradition, and people hold their traditions. They want to hold on to their traditions is the way they would talk about it at the college I went to. So I'll go to the college in the early 1980s that started having that symbol in the 1920s, and they'd gotten rid of it officially in the 1970s. That is a 50-year-old tradition people were clinging to. Mm-hmm. And are still clinging to, 30 years later or 25 years later. I mean, that's, I don't know, I thought of traditions as a lot longer.
Yeah.
I thought they had a lot of land. I mean, I think of them as based in the land and having a tenure and living somewhere. I didn't know you could, pay somebody to make a logo and within 20 years everybody be fiercely clinging to it. But I mean, it seems like there is a vacuum if that's what people are going to do, if they're going to cling to those things. But look at all the money that sports teams get, and that, teachers don't get when you compare the two things, the values, we value these sports teams enormously. We value our teachers not at all. The difference between them shows this one thing has an emblem of our need for clan and culture and tribe. The other thing, we can't understand it, so we don't value it.
Maybe teachers need to be better at making logos. That would be the breakthrough.
Yeah, that's the thing, But then you get that whole sports team mascot thing at your school. Then, yeah. But no, it is part of how what you value is what you project, and not what you do every day. But it really is what you do every day. I don't think that made a lot of sense.
No, it totally did. I wonder
what you want to say you value is what you project, but what you do every day is really what you value.
You live your values no matter what you say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah. We send our kids to school every day, right? We only go to sports games on the weekend. One we could live without.
School.
Yeah.
I think I misunderstood your entire
Yeah.
message.
No, we could live without going to the one thing we do once a week.
Right.
The thing we do every day is the thing
Or
that
you can still go to your sports game and just have different symbols to represent the
I
teams.
suppose.
Like, that's a nice compromise, I feel like.
Yeah, I suppose the symbols help, but I think it's the whole thing is showing how we identify and the values that we hold. So
I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about some stereotypes.
okay.
I mean, I think we're kind of touching on some of that already.
Yeah.
But you mentioned money. The sports teams make a lot of money, and teachers don't make very much money.
Mm-hmm.
The various native populations in the U.S. are, I think, statistically shown like the economics are really rough in those situations.
Yeah. I mean, there are very few tribes where the medium income is above the poverty level on the reservations, and in the cities, there's similar statistics.
And so I feel like people do multiple things. They have this view of poverty-stricken reservations that are sad, broken places. I think a lot of people say the thing of, well, why don't you use those Indian casinos to pay for everything?
Sure, yeah, casino money.
And I think people don't let the idea of a native person become modern to let you just be a person who lives in the city and
right,
but is still a part of a tribe.
Yeah, that you somehow have to live on the reservation, or and there are lots of native people who have that notion too, and I don't blame them. But yeah, so it can't be modern. You can't have your own industry. Casinos happens to be one of our industries. I mean, not everybody's rich because there's a razor blade factory in town.
Right.
It's like, I mean, that would be the equivalent for a very small rural town in any part of, North America. Just because the farmers are doing well and getting that corn out there for ethanol does not mean that the average person in town is doing well.
Yeah, even the people working on the farm.
Right, exactly, or even the farm workers, yeah. So, I mean, casinos are just industries like anything else. One thing that has changed is infrastructure is better for a lot of tribes. We had no infrastructure. I mean, there was not a stoplight in my town. There's not a paved, not a paved road, but there were very few paved roads. Housing was quite bad when I was a kid. I didn't grow up on my reservation, but visited all the reservations near me often enough to know that there is a big difference. But those are basics that are still struggling with, that most towns, majority white towns, haven't seen since the Depression, So, since the Great Depression of the 20th century.
You're marking that because there's modern depressions.
Right, yeah. That we call now recessions, or what do we call them? It's something like the turn down.
Yeah.
So depressing. That's like, the turn down is like what happens after you are on a kind of a high.
Yeah.
That's like when you have like a big event after a wedding or something.
I think of it as just when you change the sheets in a hotel room. Turn down service.
Oh, the turn down service. Yeah, it sounds so benign compared to what we all experienced. Or most of us experienced.
No stability anywhere? Let's call it a turn down. It's fine.
Yeah.
Well, that I think speaks to also there's a thing that is, I think, all the spaces you live in, I mean, a teacher, an artist, and a person who's representing your tribe is ways of minimizing. So the turn down, that terminology like minimizes this financial disaster.
Right. Anybody can survive a turn down.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's just you're going to be a turn up pretty soon.
Walk it off.
Right? Yeah.
Turn it back up. Just bootstraps yourself, whatever that. But I wonder if you can speak to why there is this obfuscation of these things that matter. Like, why we either want to ignore or feel pity for, like, native peoples.
Yeah. Well, I love these questions because, well, first of all, they're complex, and most people don't ask complex questions about native people at all. But the other thing is that every time you ask something, I'm like, oh, that's your perspective. Oh, how interesting. Because it's just not my perspective. But I think I have sort of thought about it before. I've thought, why do people want to do this? I think they want to, they definitely want to simplify because it is complex. 560 some native nations, different cultures, hundreds of different cultures, hundreds of different languages, hundreds of different locations. It's an incredibly complex web under this umbrella identity of American Indian or Native American or Indigenous, and those things all mean different things. So it's like it's so much easier just to, put braids on it, put a feather on it. That's what an Indian is, or that's what a Native person is, or that's what an Indigenous person in North America is. I understand why people want to simplify. Sometimes we need to simplify just to recognize one another too. There's that. I'm thinking about that a lot too. How do you recognize one another? How do you become part of, say, an art movement if you're not willing to use some of the signifiers, some of the symbols that are so obvious to people? But I think people don't want it to be too complex because it's harder to put in, whatever category or box or learn the appropriate behavior. It makes you think of the largeness of culture and the persistence of culture over time. Oh my gosh, there are Native people on the East Coast. That blows people's minds. Persistent Native nations. You won't know the protocols for all these different cultures. Yeah, so I think it's more about simplification, but it's also about wanting it to be in the past because the contemporary obligations to Native nations is just, it's a lot. There's a lot to repair, so it's a complicated prospect to understand and repair in all these places and realize that the whole land mass has a Native history, an Indigenous history. That's a big thing for people to realize.
Well, so I have this question. I want to know if it's condescending or if this idea is condescending, and I feel like you'll tell me. Every place I've ever performed a show on has been on what was Native land.
Yeah, everything.
Everywhere I've pretty much been.
Everything between the two oceans.
And so I feel like there should be, at the beginning of any kind of an event, some acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, that's a protocol that many people use. Yeah, here we are on Native land. I want to acknowledge it.
Yeah. But there doesn't seem, is there any like performing allyship component to that? That's at all like you're trying to get attention for it rather than being sincere about it, or does that speak too much to intentionality and hard to? You can't know what's in someone's heart kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, some people might be like, oh, dude, why are you doing that? There might be people who don't like it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you got to find your way to do it in a way that is both sincere. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's funny. It's just like, you don't go around smudging people because not everybody needs to be smudged. But acknowledging where you are, I think only the grumpiest people can not tolerate that. I mean, like everything, you don't want to do something just to make it seem like you're with it, you're down with the brothers or whatever,
Just every interaction you have. Yeah. Before I buy this coffee, I want to acknowledge standing on Native land.
That would be awesome. I would love that. Before I eat this food, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous agriculturalists who knew that this chocolate would be valuable to us one day, and
people would be so tired of waiting for when they can do their things.
I would like to acknowledge pumpkin spice as an Indigenous tradition that white girls now love.
If just that, like you had to say that before you got any pumpkin spice.
Yeah, exactly.
It'd be really powerful.
We should have put that on the cups when they wanted to talk about race. Let's talk about race and pumpkin spice. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way to do it. It'll happen. It's like, in New Zealand, it happens. In some places in Canada. I mean, here too. I mean, in the arts community in the Twin Cities, there is much more acknowledgement of standing on Native ground and this being a Dakota place and so forth. So, and I'm encountering that from non-Indigenous artists much more often.
So there's change.
Yeah, I think there's change, possible. Awareness, acknowledgement. Mm-hmm.
So this is the other piece of like putting a burden on you. Mm-hmm. That idea of acknowledgement and awareness seems like a thing we all can do. Mm-hmm. What other things can non-Native folks do that work towards, I don't know if it's reparations or healing, trauma repair? Like what are the small or big, like this needs to happen pieces that you know of? And I'm making you speak for everyone.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, we can't all speak for everyone. I particularly don't like to be the one who speaks, and although people won't believe that because I'm out there all the time, but they don't know how many times I've said no before I finally say yes, or say talk to so-and-so, talk to this other person. And so I guess maybe this is an unlikely place, but I think it would be awesome if people just asked for a sense of what an Indigenous person or a Native person would think about whatever they're planning to do, just ask. Is there some aspect of this? Like if you're a big institution, have a committee, and feed them and give them a little ching, and then don't tell them afterwards, we've made this terrible mistake. We need you to help us fix it. Or we'd like you for free to add a little pumpkin spice, little Indian spice, little indigenous spice to our plan because, oops, we forgot, we completely ignored that, or we could get this other grant if you do. And that's really the way things operate in the arts community and in the cultural community right now. Not everybody. I mean, I love and work with and admire anybody who runs any organization because it's herding cats at all times and tap dancing for money. So I understand that, but I just, I'm just going to think of this one little narrow area and a part that just completely impacts Native artists and people trying to express our cultural concerns, which are always political for us, I think. It's almost universal that we're doing whatever we're doing is political, even if we don't know it is, or even if we don't want it to be. So one of the things is always just this either being not brought to the table or being brought to the table to be sprinkled on the food or stirred into the latte. That could change. People could change that in some realistic way. There's some people who've done a good job, and even once they've done a good job, they sometimes screw up, and I'm willing to be, I'm just naturally open to people making mistakes, and I don't think being racist, appropriative, or anything along between those spectrums is unforgivable. I understand how people make mistakes, and I might not be alone. I might be alone in that. A lot of people would love to just write everybody off, but I don't think that's a problem. I think that we just need to keep struggling toward goals of understanding, and we'll get there. Maybe when we're all related.
Right. Yeah. Inter-family and inter-people's sort of reproduction is the answer to everything.
Yeah. That's how I got here. Is being white and Native, Ojibwe and German, and yeah. You kind of understand more perspectives that way, I think, which was part of that privilege I started out talking about.
Yeah. Well, so that's a good thing to sort of maybe wrap up. Is how do you feel like you've done a little bit of what are your privileges and how do they serve you to serve the parts of you that aren't privileged, that does one help the other? Yeah,
it's been a big part of my work this year. I've been writing and talking about what is privilege, and I sort of was ahead of the conversation where that word is sort of disgusting because you've said it too many times.
It's a little buzzwordy.
Right, it's a buzzword, and it feels like it's excusing people. It'd be walk into the room and I'm bringing my privilege with me. And it's it's almost like they've said they've just passed gas or something. It's please just stop that.
They've confessed to the priest.
Right.
So now I'm good. I don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. It's their confession. It's their, I don't know, their waft. I don't know what it is, but I know I come in here with this looming cloud about me, but that is not where I was going at all. I was really investigating the notion of how, what I'm able to do has to do with who I am, the fact that I'm what some people call light-skinned Indian, but that's a huge spectrum too. I've known full-blood people who are very light. Yeah, so it's so there'd be that. But then as I've thought about it, I think the prime privileges I hold are my education, which I engaged ferociously from the time I was a teenager and a young teenager, and I wanted to go to a really good school, and I got a scholarship, and I left home, and I went to an Eastern boarding school, and I, had a 10-year education at, what are considered the top institutions. So that was very important to me, and that is a thing that opens doors. There's an educated class in the United States, and teachers often belong to it. You don't make money. You don't have the class privilege of having the ease of money. You're often having the ease of debt, which is a very different thing. You can move and live in other classes because you can talk like them, you can code switch, you can pass in ways, but doesn't mean you're not the same person when you're in the room, and that your values are not the same as a Native person living on a reservation, or somebody who hasn't had an education, or somebody who doesn't have a home. So those are the privileges that I have been looking at and examining. And then the other one that's kind of now I'm starting to think about is having a partner, and a partner who has money, and a partner who's not from a group that's historically oppressed. I got a white guy for a partner. It's a whole different life.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I could ask you a million questions, but you're busy with a lot of your other life, with all the rest of your life. So I think like my final thing is to ask, where would people go to connect with you or to connect with your work? I feel like you could give like a dozen answers to that.
Yeah, well, I have a website for my general where I'm going to be and what I'm doing. I have a new book coming out in 2017, Curator of Ephemera, at the New Museum for Archaic Media, which is an odd book. In it, there are little QR codes to see my poem films. I'm pretty hard not to find. Mm-hmm. I'm all over the intertubes. So, yes, please find out more. And then hopefully eventually I'll finish my book where I'm writing about exactly these things. I'm really grateful to you for asking me to have this conversation. It warms me up for the work I'm going to be doing in Oakland in the next 4 days.
Good. Good. Well,
Plus, you're always so interesting.
Thanks. Well, Thanks a lot for talking to me.
You're welcome. Thanks, Steve. Bye.
So that was my conversation with Heid. I really enjoy spending time with Heid, and I like how open and funny and darkly funny she can be about really challenging things, and she has a distinctive perspective. So I hope you appreciate it, and I hope you will seek her out. Pretty much just Google Heid Erdrich on anywhere, and you will find a lot of wonderful resources. She's written amazing books. She writes great poetry. She's a part of a lot of collaborative, creative projects. Seek those things out. I also hope you will seek out resources around Native American appropriation. There's a lot of answers to these questions on the internet and places. There's a lot of really thoughtful people who can speak on these things. So I encourage you to do further study if you haven't already. The theme song for Not About You is Rebels of Our Own Kind by Minneapolis musician Charlie Van Stee. If you'd like to leave a comment, a story of your own, any kind of feedback, the voicemail is 612-361-9261. You can also interact with us on social media, and the hashtag is NAYPOD, NAPOD. You can find Not About You Pod on Twitter. You can also find me directly. I'm at @ThatLevi. I hope you will share comments, feedback, and share this show with other people. I want to get this out to as many people as I can to broaden and expand these conversations. If you have time and you are willing and you want to review the show on iTunes, that helps get more people aware of the show and helps me grow and connect with more folks. If you have suggestions of people I can connect with, I'm always looking to connect with more activists, organizers, educators, thinkers, artists. Any feedback you have, 612-361-9261. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Thank you for sharing the show with others. This has been Not About You.